No, the old homes are dilapidated, and I mean, you just drive around some of these small old towns. They're just not good. Well, you know, back in late 1840s to 1850s, this was nothing. This was just bare land. And the Norwegians that came from Norway, a whole bunch, I mean, thousands of them, thousands, settled in central Illinois, close to Chicago. And they send out 4 scouts to scout out this land from Chicago. Now you're talking about, what, 350 miles to Chicago, but they came by oxen and wagon, and they found this land here in the Huxley area, and they called it the land of milk and honey. They came from farms that were only 20 acres, where, you know, you could buy the land out here for $1.25 an acre. Can you imagine that, buying this land for $1? And then that's how they got settled here. And then Huxley was founded in 1882 when the Milwaukee Railroad came through from the West Coast all the way to New York City. They came through Huxley, Slater, Huxley, Cambridge, on east. That's why so many of the towns along here started, because of the railroad.
Its freight trains make possible the vast daily flow of raw materials from forest, mine, and farm to manufacturer, and a finished product from manufacturer to widespread consumer markets. The shipping of freight by rail has always been the lifeblood of modern American industry. Today, the railroad continues as the very basis of the economic life of the nation. Representative of the new spirit that is building for the greater Southland of today and tomorrow, the seaboard, in freight traffic, as well as in passenger service, is a notable example of the drive and know-how characteristic of the entire field of rail transportation throughout the length and breadth of our country.
We once were a very large community, but the advent of the automobile and the going away of the stagecoach, the removal of the railroad line, and less reliance on rail transportation resulted in this community really shrinking fast.
We lost our railroad in '76 and it closed. But in the early days, in the 1950s, we had a rail line that actually people could go 15 miles into a neighboring community that was larger. Olwine was the name, and they could go in, get groceries, and take the train back to Aurora, and that's how you could get across and get to a lot of small communities. It goes back several decades, but farm to market roads was another initiative to improve rural roads, and they were called farm to market roads. And then Eisenhower and the interstates was a design to get product across the country, and that was a great addition to moving vehicles, getting people to just transporting them with the interstates. So they're very important, but the interstates aren't going to go to every community.
Huxley's lucky because, you know, we're a main thoroughfare between Ames and Des Moines. You know, when I was growing up, for instance, Highway 69 was the main thoroughfare from Winnipeg, Canada to New Orleans, Louisiana. We had 5 gas stations in Huxley. When the interstate came, we had 1, you know, because you're off the path. This was what really hurt a lot of small communities, because you didn't have the traffic through these towns to support the businesses that were in towns.
Yeah, they're declining in a number of ways. They're declining in population, they're declining in the quality of life in those communities, they're declining economically. Poverty rates are some of the highest in the state. They're the best and the brightest. Those with the resources tending to leave these small towns, kind of you're hollowing out these small towns as they move to larger cities. So in some ways, you know, we call it rural ghettoization. So we kind of are familiar with in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, kind of the hollowing out of the urban core as people left kind of the core. People used to live in the cities, like Des Moines, and then, mainly through white flight, people moved out to the suburbs increasingly so that the core is only left with the poorest of the poor that don't leave. But we're seeing something similar happening in rural communities where sort of the best and the brightest leave rural communities. The only people that stay are the ones that can't leave. And so a lot of the problems of some of the worst rural communities tend to mirror that of some of the worst urban communities. High rates of people with no skills, high rates of people with disabilities, people that are really stuck, and so there's no opportunity for them to advance themselves.
So when you look at socioeconomic stressors, whether it's a job, money, or food, there's a real significant correlation with bad things that happen to people. When you talk about the beginning of the opioid epidemic, at first I'd say it established a foothold in rural communities under the auspices of sort of an age of innocence. We trust our doctors, this is a great drug, and I don't feel my pain anymore. And the most vulnerable communities, which were our rural communities, had the doctors that had a lot of old people with pain and were prescribing opioid medications. The kids were stealing medications from parents and grandparents. They were kids that would go get a toe reset from a football game or a knee surgery, and they were getting big opioid medications. But people weren't told this is highly addictive. You're actually, after 4 or 5 days, it's no longer masking the pain. You're craving the drug because you're addicted. There's this dopamine response, and you want more of this drug.
As your body has the substance in, your body can respond to that stimulus by putting more receptors on cell surfaces, and that's what we call upregulation. As you take it away, downregulation. And so when someone's using consistently and trying to get high, body's going to start upregulating the receptors on the cell surfaces, which means it takes more of the substance and more frequent uses of the substance to achieve a similar or the same high. And if you talk to addicts, a lot of them will tell you it's that first high is always the best, and they're chasing that what has hooked them and what they're going for, that feeling of the euphoria, just good and better. And as they use more, get that upregulation, it takes more and more and more to kind of achieve similar results. I know the CDC, from what they track, they estimate anywhere from like a third to even upwards of maybe a half of addictions start with prescription opioids. These are people who have injuries, surgeries, whether that be from they get into a car accident, get hurt at work, or even just a regular procedure. They have to have like a hernia repaired or something. Quite often opioids are prescribed for these because they work very well for the lasting pain control of either trauma or the surgical procedure that's done.
In the last 5 years I've had minor operations. The doctor, he just prescribed, didn't ask me what I wanted, didn't ask me if I wanted. They just automatically prescribed the opioid.
I think you're seeing it now that they were distributed too easily.
And one of the most difficult aspects of it is the fact that how few resources there are to help mitigate those problems.
You'll still meet people who think addiction is a choice, and it isn't. It is very much an illness that needs to be treated very as such. And those people who think that vote, and those votes end up creating policies and laws, which cascades the effect down the line to where we are now, from even as far back as the Reagan administration, when they really started cutting funding from mental health processes. And we see this closing of all these mental health facilities or hospitals or places where addicts, where people who are just profoundly struggling with mental illness, suicidal ideations could go get help and be returned to a point where they are part of society and healed and recovered. And now we have them sitting in the ER there are times I'll see patients who we're trying to find placement for in a mental health facility or an addiction facility, and they've been in our ER for over 100 hours because there's just nowhere in the state for them. We have an inpatient ward here at Greeley. It fills up quickly. And so the closest bed might be 3.5 hours away. And that's not uncommon for it to be 3.5 hours away because we just do not have enough funding or enough beds available.
You get mental health services that are best received someplace other than here. Well, what happens when you can't get from here to there? What happens when transportation is cumbersome? What happens when you don't have a car? What happens when you can't afford to put gas in the car? Okay, now we're vulnerable. But then you've also got a neighbor who will say, hey, do you need a ride? Or people can call.
There's still that big stigma behind people who are mentally ill. It is not treated as a medical condition as it should be. People are still kind of looked down upon. They're much more likely to be homeless, which you see a lot more addiction in the homeless population. They're much more likely to also just abuse drugs, participate in higher risk activities and behaviors, especially your manic depressives when they're in the manic states or the mania states. And so I think a lot of it is probably because of how we treat and try to manage mental illness and mental health in this country. I think we've come a long ways. I think we have a long way to go.
There's another junkie. There's another tweaker. There's another pothead. I think here people realize that's Bob from down the street. That's Mr. Peterson. That's Mr. Smith. You know, these people have names. They have an identity. We have a connection to them. We're going to help.
Oh, I think it's a pretty tight-knit community. I mean, even though we're spread out miles apart, you know, most people within 5 miles of here. You know, see them driving down the road and you wave at them, smile, say hi to them when you see them in town or at the co-op.
I think it was in 1983 when the embargo was instituted. It really hurt the farmers because the grain prices went down the tube and a lot of the farmers couldn't make payments for their farm ground, so they lost their farms. And that's when a lot of the farms were from 160 to 300 acres. It went to 1,000 acres to 2,000 acres. They were gobbled up by other big farmers. And that's what, you know, the decline of a lot of the small towns, because there just wasn't the population to support those towns.
You just see a lot of despair. People that were losing money year after year and didn't have enough put aside, or they used up everything they had put aside and they just couldn't do it anymore. I hate to see it go away from the local farmer that's been farming it for 30 years, 40 years. But on the other hand, if there's not someone in the family to pick it up, what are you going to do? You're going to have to sell it. And the problem with, even though I've been doing it for 50 years with my dad, when he decides to retire or give it up, I couldn't buy it. Everything's too darn expensive. There's no way. So that's when my dad has to make a decision to sell it. There's some local farmers around that have a lot of money that might want to buy it. But if they don't, or even if they do, these large corporations come, and they've got lots of money, and they'll just outbid them, and there it goes away from the local farmer again.
Some of the towns that are really withering, I think, are going to face the situation that a lot of communities in the Great Plains are facing, that you're going to have ever-shrinking populations. The towns are not going to be able to support themselves, so they're going to become disincorporated. They won't be actual towns. Schools will continue to consolidate. There'll be county, basically school districts that cover the entire county, if not a county and a half. I don't think, for some of these communities, the future is bleak, particularly in west central Iowa and south Iowa, where the population losses are much faster and the quality of life and economic gains are much slower. It's just going to accelerate people leaving.